These are the 45 historical events governments want you to forget. Entire chapters of human history ripped out, censored, and buried under silence. What you were taught in school was never the whole story, it was the edited version, crafted to protect those in power. Behind every anthem and every flag are secrets written in blood. Tonight, those forbidden pages are being opened, page by page. Chapter 1: The Amritsar Massacre, 1919, British India. In April of 1919, thousands of men, women, and children gathered peacefully in a walled garden in Amritsar, India. They carried no weapons. Many had come with their families, believing they were safe. But safety was an illusion. British soldiers sealed the exits, cutting off every path of escape. Then came the order. Without warning, rifles opened fire into the crowd. Bullets tore through mothers shielding their children, through men praying for mercy. There was no pause, no hesitation, only relentless gunfire that turned the garden into a slaughterhouse. When it was over, the ground was slick with blood and the air reeked of death. What followed was just as horrifying. London tried to erase it. Reports were silenced, numbers buried, the massacre painted as a lesson in discipline. But the truth refused to die. Amritsar became a wound that scarred a nation's memory. But across the ocean, another city would burn, and its story would be buried in silence for nearly a century. Chapter 2: The Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921, USA. In 1921, Greenwood, Oklahoma, was called Black Wall Street. It was one of the richest black communities in America, built on hard work, pride, and defiance. For a moment, it seemed untouchable. But wealth paints a target, and hatred sharpened the knives. One night in June, a rumor sparked violence. White mobs descended on Greenwood, looting businesses, torching homes, and dragging families into the street. The sky turned black with smoke. Airplanes dropped incendiary devices, raining fire on a community that had built itself from nothing. In less than 24 hours, Black Wall Street was reduced to rubble. Hundreds were killed, thousands left homeless. And then came the most devastating blow of all: silence. Officials called it a riot, reports vanished, survivors were hushed. For decades, it was as if Greenwood had never existed. But America wasn't the only one burying its crimes. In the forests of Eastern Europe, another atrocity was hidden beneath layers of lies and denial. Chapter 3: The Katyn Forest Massacre, 1940, USSR, Poland. In the spring of 1940, thousands of Polish officers, professors, and leaders were taken from prison camps under the promise of relocation. They didn't know they were being led to their graves. Trucks carried them deep into the Katyn Forest, where the earth had already been prepared. One by one, men were bound, blindfolded, and executed with a bullet to the back of the head. The silence of the forest swallowed their screams. Night after night, mass graves swallowed. Thousands, over 20,000 lives extinguished with mechanical precision. But the killing wasn't the most sinister part. The cover-up was. When the graves were discovered, Moscow blamed the Nazis. For half a century, the Soviet Union denied responsibility, rewriting textbooks, silencing families, and punishing anyone who dared speak the truth. Only in 1990 did the Kremlin finally admit the crime, but by then, the damage was done. And just when the world thought such horrors belonged to dictatorships, a similar nightmare unfolded under the banner of democracy in Vietnam. Chapter 4: The My Lai Massacre, 1968, Vietnam War. In March of 1968, American soldiers entered a small village called My Lai. They had been told it was crawling with Viet Cong fighters. Instead, what they found were farmers, women, children, and the elderly. But orders were orders, and suspicion turned into slaughter. Machine guns opened fire. Entire families were wiped out in seconds. Infants were shot point blank. Women were assaulted before being killed. For 4 hours, the village was torn apart until more than 500 unarmed civilians lay dead. It wasn't war, it was extermination. Then came the most chilling twist, the cover-up. Reports were rewritten, photographs buried, commanders promoted. Whistleblowers were smeared as traitors. For over a year, Washington denied everything, hoping the blood of My Lai would sink into the soil and disappear. But truth has a way of clawing back to the surface, and when it did, the world recoiled. But even My Lai was only a shadow of the horrors unleashed in China, where an entire city drowned in fire and blood. Chapter 5. The Nanjing Massacre, 1937, Imperial Japan. In December of 1937, Japanese troops stormed the Chinese capital of Nanjing. Civilians begged for mercy, believing the conquerors would respect their surrender. But mercy never came. The occupation unleashed 6 weeks of terror that turned the city into a graveyard. Soldiers went door to door, dragging families into the streets. Women were assaulted in broad daylight, victims numbering in the tens of thousands. Men were lined up in rows and cut down with machine guns, bayonets, even swords. Children were thrown into rivers. The blood of an entire city ran into its soil. Conservative estimates put the dead at 200,000, though survivors whispered of numbers far higher. And then came the betrayal of memory. Japan's official accounts diluted the massacre, textbooks erased the brutality, and politicians tried to call it exaggerated. But the silence of the victims speaks louder than any denial, and when empires collapse, the chaos doesn't end, it multiplies. In India, the birth of freedom came drenched in blood. Chapter 6. The Partition of India's Hidden Atrocities, 1947. In August of 1947, independence came to India. The Union Jack fell, but in its place, hurried lines were drawn across maps. Those lines ripped apart villages, families, and centuries of coexistence. Overnight, neighbors became enemies. Trains filled with refugees never arrived at their destinations. Instead, they pulled into stations carrying only corpses, silent metal coffins on wheels. Entire columns of men, women, and children were cut down on roads they thought would lead to safety. Fires consumed villages, and mobs swept through towns with machetes and torches. In a few months, more than 1 million lives were lost, and millions more displaced. Yet leaders celebrated it as freedom. History books told of triumph. But the real story was a river of blood buried beneath speeches. The partition was not just independence, it was one of the largest forced migrations in history, paid for in agony. But while India bled, across the seas in Washington, officials were drawing up plans that would horrify the world if exposed. Chapter 7. Operation Northwoods, 1962 USA. In 1962, the United States was obsessed with toppling Fidel Castro. Behind closed doors, generals drafted a plan so shocking it reads like fiction. Its name, Operation Northwoods. The proposals were chilling. Fake terrorist attacks staged on American soil, passenger planes blown up, cities bombed, innocent civilians sacrificed not by enemies but by their own government. The goal? Blame Cuba, inflame public outrage, and justify invasion. This wasn't the work of fringe radicals, it came from the Pentagon itself. The plan rose all the way to President Kennedy's desk. He rejected it, refusing to stain America with its own blood. But the documents survived, and when they surfaced decades later, they revealed just how far governments will go when power outweighs morality. Operation Northwoods never happened, but it could have, and the fact it was even written is a scar that never fades. And if that sounds extreme, wait until you hear what the CIA did when they turned human minds into laboratories. Chapter 8. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control experiments 1950s-70s. In the shadows of the Cold War, the CIA launched one of its darkest projects, MK-Ultra. The goal was nothing less than control of the human mind. Unwitting civilians, students, even hospital patients became test subjects. Without consent, They were given LSD, subjected to hypnosis, locked in isolation, and pushed to the edge of madness. Some never returned. Others took their own lives. Their families never told the truth. The program spread across universities, prisons, and even foreign countries. And it wasn't just experiments, it was torture disguised as science. Files were destroyed before the project was exposed, but what remains paints a nightmare of government-sanctioned cruelty. The revelation shook America. Its own citizens had been used like lab rats. And if this was what surfaced, what was burned in the furnace of secrecy? But if you think mind control is chilling, wait until you uncover how Washington used weapons and cash to play both sides of a global war. Chapter 9, The Iran-Contra Scandal, 1980s, USA by the 1980s. The Reagan administration had sworn never to negotiate with terrorists. But behind closed doors, a dangerous game was unfolding. American officials secretly sold weapons to Iran, then under embargo, and funneled the profits to Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras. It was illegal, defiant of Congress, and cloaked in layers of deception. When the scandal broke, Washington scrambled. Officials claimed ignorance, shredded documents, and staged denials, but the evidence was too heavy. What the world saw was the U.S. government breaking its own laws while preaching morality to others. In the end, key players escaped serious punishment, and the scandal became a blueprint, proof that even when caught red-handed, power often shields itself. The Iran-Contra affair wasn't just corruption, it was treason against trust. And once the public learned how deep the lies went, they began to question every war, every speech, every promise. And those doubts would explode when one mysterious naval encounter dragged America into its bloodiest war since World War II. Chapter 10, The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964, Vietnam War Trigger. On August 2, 1964, Washington claimed North Vietnamese boats had attacked a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, another attack was reported. The evidence? Murky at best. But President Johnson seized the moment. The reports, real or fabricated, were used to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, handing the president broad powers to wage war in Vietnam. Here's the truth: the second attack likely never happened. Yet, from that phantom assault, a full-scale war was launched. Millions of Vietnamese lives were destroyed. Over 58,000 Americans came home in coffins, all justified by a lie. The Gulf of Tonkin wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was the match that lit a jungle on fire. And when the smoke cleared, the world realized how easily truth can be twisted into war. But Vietnam wasn't the first time mass death was buried under official lies. For that, we go back to 1915. Chapter 11, The Armenian Genocide, 19,151,916, Ottoman Empire. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire declared its Armenian population a threat. What followed was not relocation, it was annihilation. Families were forced from their homes, marched into deserts with no food or water, and slaughtered along the way. Convoys of men were executed by firing squads. Women and children were driven into the Syrian desert to die of hunger and thirst. Villages were burned, churches emptied, communities erased. By the time the killing ended, more than 1 million Armenians were dead. But the crime did not stop with murder. The empire denied it, erasing records, silencing survivors, branding it all a lie. Even today, governments struggle to say the word genocide, as if refusing to name it will erase its shadow. The Armenian genocide wasn't just an atrocity, it was a warning ignored. And that silence gave license for future horrors. But long before 1915, another revolution had been erased, a revolution so successful, its victors were nearly written out of history altogether. Chapter 12, The Erasure of the Haitian Revolution, 17,911,804, The Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave uprising in history. Enslaved men and women rose against France, defeated Napoleon's armies, and declared the First Black Republic. It should have been celebrated as a triumph of freedom. Instead, the world turned its back. Western governments buried the story, terrified of inspiring revolts in their own colonies. Textbooks spoke of the American and French revolutions, but Haiti's victory was silenced, treated as if it had never happened. France demanded crippling reparations, bleeding Haiti's economy for centuries, while the United States refused recognition for nearly 60 years. The greatest act of liberation in history was transformed into a cautionary tale, proof that power writes history, not justice. The Haitian Revolution proved the enslaved could not only rebel, but win, and that truth was dangerous enough to erase. And when it came to Africa, another empire cloaked its crimes in silence, crimes so brutal they rivaled the worst the world has ever seen. Chapter 13. The Congo Free State Atrocities, 18,851,908, Belgium. When King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo as his personal colony, he promised progress. Instead, he built a kingdom of terror. Villagers were forced into the forests to harvest rubber under impossible quotas. Failure meant punishment, beatings, mutilation, executions. Soldiers hacked off hands as proof of discipline. Children were taken hostage to force parents into labor. Millions perished, not in war, but under the daily cruelty of one man's greed. The Congo became a graveyard hidden from Europe's conscience. Reports that leaked were dismissed, photographs suppressed, voices silenced. Leopold spun himself as a philanthropist while his colony drowned in blood. By the time international outrage forced Belgium to intervene, an estimated 10 million Congolese were gone, a holocaust in plain sight, erased by distance and denial. But starvation can kill as effectively as bullets, and in Stalin's empire, famine became a weapon of war. Chapter 14. The Holodomor Famine, 19,321,933, USSR in Ukraine. Fields of wheat stretched to 32. Stalin's policies turned that abundance into death. Grain was seized, villages blockaded, and entire regions left to starve. Families ate bark, grass, even their pets. Parents watched their children waste away, powerless to stop it. Millions died not because food didn't exist, but because it was taken from them. It was famine by design, a weapon meant to crush resistance and silence a nation. Western journalists who tried to expose the famine were discredited, while Soviet propaganda painted pictures of prosperity. For decades, the Holodomor was denied, erased from Soviet memory, as if millions of dead Ukrainians had never lived. The Holodomor wasn't a tragedy of nature. It was a crime of policy, and silence made it possible. And decades later, on the other side of the world, another famine would claim even more lives under the watch of a dictator. Chapter 15. The Great Chinese Famine, 19,591,961, Mao's China. Under Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, China promised a golden age of agriculture and industry. Instead, it unleashed one of the deadliest famines in human history. Fields were stripped bare by policies that valued ideology over survival. Unrealistic quotas robbed peasants of their grain, while local officials lied to avoid punishment. As food vanished, desperation set in. Millions scavenged for roots, bark, and insects. Some villages were entirely wiped out. The official death toll remains debated, but estimates range from 30 to 45 million lives, lost not to drought, but to deliberate blindness. And still the truth was buried. The government called it 3 difficult years, as if a euphemism could mask starvation on a scale greater than any war. The Great Chinese Famine wasn't a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, and one still shrouded in denial. But famine was only one form of silence. On a battlefield in Africa, entire armies were erased from the record. Chapter 16, The Battle of Quito Cuanavale. Cover-up 1987, Angola. In the late 1980s, Angola became the stage for one of the largest battles on African soil since World War II. Cuban, Angolan, and South African forces clashed in Quito Cuanavale, a fight that would shape the end of apartheid. For months, artillery thundered, and bodies fell. The South African army, once thought unstoppable, was driven back. But in Pretoria, officials painted the retreat as a tactical maneuver. The truth, that apartheid's military had suffered a crushing defeat, was buried under propaganda. Quito Cuanavale wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point. Its outcome paved the way for Namibian independence and sped up apartheid's collapse. Yet history books in the West barely mention it. A war that shifted the balance of power in Africa was treated as a footnote. Silence wasn't an accident. It was strategy. And while soldiers died on battlefields, civilians were massacred in secret wars closer to home. Chapter 17, The Guatemalan Civil War Genocide, 19,601,996. For 36 years, Guatemala bled in a civil war that the world barely noticed. Indigenous Mayan communities bore the brunt, caught between government forces and guerrilla fighters. But the deadliest violence came from the state itself. Villages were bombed, crops burned, and civilians slaughtered in campaigns labeled counterinsurgency. Entire families were wiped out to silence dissent. Over 200,000 people were killed or disappeared, most of them indigenous. The government insisted it was fighting communists. In reality, it was committing genocide. And while mass graves filled the countryside, allies abroad looked the other way. Reports were buried, documents classified, voices silenced. When peace accords finally came in 1996, the scars were too deep. Guatemala's people had been punished for existing, and their stories nearly erased. But Guatemala wasn't alone. In El Salvador, a single massacre nearly wiped an entire village off the map. Chapter 18, The El Mozote Massacre, 1981, El Salvador. In December 1981, the tiny village of El Mozote became the stage for a horror few outside El Salvador would ever hear about. Soldiers from the U.S.-trained Atla Cattle Battalion stormed the town under the banner of fighting rebels. What followed was slaughter. Men were separated and executed. Women were raped before being shot. Children were herded into buildings, then gunned down. Nearly 1,000 civilians were exterminated in a matter of days. For years, the massacre was denied. Officials in El Salvador called it communist propaganda. In Washington, the reports were buried, too inconvenient for Cold War politics. The victims were silenced twice, once by bullets, then by lies. It took a truth commission years later to confirm what survivors always knew. El Mozote was not a battle. It was a crime against humanity. And as El Salvador wept, another nation in Southeast Asia unleashed its own rivers of blood. Chapter 19, The Indonesian Mass Killings, 196,566, in 1965. A failed coup in Indonesia set off one of the bloodiest purges of the 20th century. General Suharto seized the moment, blaming communists, then ordering a nationwide extermination. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Militias hunted the accused with machetes and guns. Rivers ran red with bodies. In just a year, as many as 1 million people were slaughtered. Leftists, students, teachers, even ordinary farmers branded as sympathizers. And then came the silence. The massacre was erased from schoolbooks. The victims denied burial in memory. Western governments, eager for an anti-communist ally, applauded Suharto's rise and buried the truth under Cold War politics. For decades, survivors lived in fear, unable to speak. The silence around 1965 was not just censorship, it was terror, and while Indonesia drowned in blood, a dictator in the Philippines built his own empire of silence. Chapter 20. The Marcos Dictatorship in the Philippines, 19,721,986. In 1972, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines. He promised order. What followed was tyranny. Curfews and checkpoints blanketed the country. Opposition voices vanished into prisons, never to return. Journalists were silenced, students disappeared, and torture chambers filled with screams. While the people suffered, Marcos and his wife Imelda looted billions, flaunting their wealth in palaces and shoes while the nation starved. The United States, desperate to keep the Philippines as a Cold War ally, looked the other way. For 14 years, the dictatorship thrived under a cloak of legitimacy. Official records called it stability. In truth, it was fear stitched into the fabric of daily life. When Marcos finally fled in 1986, he left behind a broken nation and a legacy of plunder and pain that textbooks still soften. And just as the Philippines fell into silence, another war broke out over barren islands at the edge of the world. Chapter 21. The Falklands, Malvinas Wars, Hidden Costs, 1982. In 1982, Argentina and Britain clashed over a cluster of windswept islands, the Falklands, or Malvinas. To the world, it seemed like a minor war over empty land. To those who fought, it was anything but. Young, undertrained Argentine conscripts were sent into the freezing South Atlantic with little food and poor weapons. Many froze before they ever saw combat. British ships faced Argentine missiles, and entire crews vanished beneath the waves. Hundreds died on both sides in weeks of brutal fighting. But the governments sold it as glory. In Argentina, the junta painted it as patriotic sacrifice. In Britain, Thatcher used the victory to cement her power. The soldiers' suffering was buried beneath speeches and parades. For many families, the true story was silence, not triumph. The Falklands War was never about islands, it was about power, and the dead were just pawns. And while the South Atlantic froze in silence, another war rained fire on Cambodia. Chapter 22. The Secret Bombing of Cambodia, 19,691,973, USA. Officially, Cambodia was neutral during the Vietnam War. But in secret, U.S. bombers pounded its countryside for 4 years. Villages were erased from maps, families obliterated in craters, all hidden from the American public. Codenamed Operation Menu, the bombing dropped more explosives on Cambodia than were used in all of World War II. Civilians fled in terror, running from a war their government insisted wasn't happening. Survivors described the sky tearing open, fields turned into moonscapes. When the truth finally leaked, Washington denied, deflected, and minimized. The real toll, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, was swallowed by Cold War politics. The bombings destabilized Cambodia, fueling the rise of the Khmer Rouge, who would later kill millions more. The silence wasn't just about hiding bombs, it was about hiding the consequences of war itself. But America's hidden hand wasn't only in Cambodia. In Iran, it toppled a government and changed history forever. Chapter 23. Iran's 1953 coup operation, Ajax CIA. 6 In 1953, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh made a bold move. He nationalized the oil industry, taking it from British hands. It was popular at home, but intolerable to London and Washington. Behind closed doors, British intelligence and the CIA hatched Operation Ajax. Propaganda flooded the streets. Riots were staged, officials bribed, mobs unleashed. Mossadegh was toppled, and the Shah returned to power, a dictator friendly to the West but brutal to his people. The coup was hailed in secret as a victory. But it planted the seeds of decades of resentment. It was the spark that fueled the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the stormy U.S.-Iran relationship that followed. For years, Washington denied its role. Only declassified documents decades later confirmed what Iranians had always known. Their democracy had been stolen by foreign hands, and Iran was only the beginning. In Chile, another government was about to be crushed under the weight of foreign power. Chapter 24. Chile's 1973 and the overthrow of Allende, CIA-backed in 1970. Salvador Allende became the first Marxist president elected in Latin America. To Chileans, it was democracy in action. To Washington, it was a threat. The CIA poured millions into destabilization. Strikes paralyzed the economy. Rumors and propaganda spread like wildfire. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military stormed the presidential palace. Tanks rolled through Santiago. Fighter jets bombed La Moneda. Allende refused to surrender and died as his government collapsed. General Augusto Pinochet seized power, ruling through torture, disappearances, and terror. Thousands were executed, tens of thousands imprisoned. The economic miracle that followed came at the cost of broken bodies and silenced voices. For decades, U.S. involvement was denied, but documents later revealed Washington's fingerprints everywhere. Chile's democracy was strangled, and the truth almost buried with it, and Chile's agony was not unique. Across the border, Argentina descended into its own nightmare. Chapter 25. Argentina's Dirty War, 19,761,983. In 1976, Argentina's military seized power, launching what they called the process of national reorganization. But behind the slogan was terror. Dissenters, students, journalists, workers were kidnapped in the night. Thousands disappeared into secret prisons, tortured for information they often didn't have. Many were drugged and thrown alive from planes into the sea. Mothers marched in Buenos Aires, carrying photos of their missing children, demanding answers that never came. The regime insisted it was fighting subversion. In reality, it was exterminating opposition. Estimates of the disappeared reached 30,000. Their absence still haunts Argentina, a nation built on unmarked graves. For years, the truth was hidden. Western allies praised Argentina's stability. Records were destroyed, families left in limbo. Only after the junta's collapse did the horror begin to surface. The Dirty War wasn't a war. It was systematic terror, scrubbed from official history. And in the shadows of World War II, another government imported war criminals to build rockets and rewrite history. Chapter 26. Operation Paperclip Nazis in NASA 1000. Operation Paperclip Nazis in NASA. When World War II ended, the world expected Nazi leaders to face justice. Some did, but many scientists were quietly smuggled into the United States under Operation Paperclip. Their crimes were ignored in exchange for their knowledge. Rocket engineers who once built weapons for Hitler now built rockets for NASA. Doctors who experimented on concentration camp victims were given American laboratories. The men behind the V-2, a missile that terrorized Europe, were celebrated as pioneers of the space race. The truth was buried under patriotic headlines. America didn't want its citizens to know that Nazi war criminals had been repackaged as heroes. Science was the excuse, power was the motive. Operation Paperclip wasn't just a recruitment drive, it was a betrayal of justice. Justice was traded for rockets, and history was rewritten. And while Nazi scientists were welcomed in, Latin America became a graveyard for anyone who opposed dictators. Chapter 27. Operation Condor coordinated terror in Latin America, 1970s. In the 1970s, South America became a battlefield without borders. Dictators from Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay formed a secret pact called Operation Condor. Its mission: hunt down and eliminate political opponents anywhere on the continent. Agents crossed borders freely, sharing intelligence, exchanging prisoners, and orchestrating assassinations. Dissidents vanished in Buenos Aires, were tortured in Santiago, and killed in Montevideo, all under the same banner of anti-communism. Tens of thousands were disappeared. Families were broken across nations. Even in Washington, whispers suggested U.S. officials knew more than they admitted. Yet for decades, Operation Condor was denied, treated as conspiracy. Only declassified documents proved it was real. Operation Condor wasn't just repression, it was an international death squad disguised as policy. And while Condor spread fear across the South, in South Africa, another government built its own system of terror. Chapter 28: The Crimes of Apartheid South Africa. 19,481,994. For nearly half a century, South Africa was ruled by apartheid, a system that turned racism into law. Black citizens were stripped of rights, forced into homelands, and barred from schools, hospitals, and even basic dignity. Protesters were met with bullets. Entire neighborhoods were bulldozed to enforce segregation. The police state used torture chambers and executions to silence dissent. While the world condemned apartheid, many governments quietly did business, pretending they didn't see. Behind closed doors, profits mattered more than justice. Sanctions were delayed, records softened, and the crimes of apartheid were hidden behind the language of policy. By the time apartheid fell in 1994, tens of thousands had been killed or disappeared. Millions had lived half a lifetime under a system designed to erase them. Apartheid wasn't just segregation, it was a calculated system of oppression that governments tolerated for decades. And while South Africa tried to erase its crimes, in India, a single night of poison became one of the world's worst disasters. Chapter 29: The Bhopal Gas Tragedy Cover-Up, 1984, India. On December 2, 1984, a pesticide plant in Bhopal leaked toxic gas into the night air. Within hours, thousands lay dead in the streets. Survivors choked as their lungs burned. It was one of the worst industrial disasters in history. But the horror didn't end that night. The death toll climbed into the tens of thousands, and generations suffered from birth defects and chronic illnesses. Yet justice never came. The company, Union Carbide, paid only a fraction in compensation. Executives fled, shielded from accountability. The Indian government minimized the scale, and international pressure quickly faded. Bhopal was buried under legal loopholes and silence. To this day, the site remains contaminated, poisoning those who live nearby. The tragedy wasn't just the gas, it was the betrayal that followed, proof that human lives could be written off as collateral. And if Bhopal's gas cloud seemed unthinkable, 2 years later another disaster was hidden by lies that nearly doomed a continent. Chapter 30: Chernobyl Disaster Suppression. 1986, USSR. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Flames lit the sky as radioactive clouds spread across Europe. But the Soviet Union didn't warn its people. Villagers nearby watched the glowing horizon, unaware that deadly radiation was seeping into their bodies. Children played outside, weddings were held. Days passed before an evacuation was ordered, too late for many. Even then, Moscow downplayed the disaster. Numbers were falsified, deaths minimized, and scientists silenced. Soldiers sent to clean up the mess were called liquidators and given no protection. Many would die slowly, their bodies collapsing under invisible poison. Chernobyl wasn't just a catastrophe, it was a cover-up that magnified its toll. A nuclear wound that still burns. Decades later. And while the Soviet Union silenced Chernobyl, China erased its own massacre in the heart of its capital. Chapter 31: Tiananmen Square Massacre, 1989, China. In June 1989, students filled Tiananmen Square demanding democracy. For weeks, hope glimmered under banners of freedom. Then came the tanks. Soldiers opened fire on unarmed civilians, mowing down hundreds, perhaps thousands. Blood stained the pavement where chants had risen days before. The most famous image, the lone man before a column of tanks, became a symbol of defiance. But inside China, the massacre was erased. Textbooks omit it. Citizens are forbidden to speak of it. Generations grow up never knowing. But silence wasn't unique to China. In Turkey, a city burned, and its story was buried in smoke. Chapter 32, The Great Fire of Smyrna, 1922. In 1922, as Greek forces retreated from Turkey, the city of Smyrna became a tinderbox. Turkish troops entered, and fires soon engulfed entire districts. Refugees crowded the harbor, screaming for rescue as flames closed in. Ships from Western powers watched from offshore, silent, motionless, unwilling to intervene. Tens of thousands perished in the inferno or were massacred in the chaos. But official histories blurred responsibility, each side pointing fingers, while the dead became statistics. The fire was more than destruction, it was erasure, a city wiped from memory. And just decades later, silence would cost Rwanda nearly 1 million lives in 100 days. Chapter 33. The Rwanda Genocide, 1994. In April 1994, Rwanda collapsed into slaughter. Hutu extremists unleashed machetes on Tutsi neighbors. Roads became rivers of blood. Churches, once sanctuaries, turned into killing grounds. Nearly 800,000 people were exterminated in just 100 days. The world watched. UN troops were ordered not to intervene. Western powers debated definitions, while families were hacked apart. When the genocide ended, silence covered the graves. Governments claimed ignorance, though the warnings had been clear. Rwanda was not only a genocide, it was proof of global betrayal. And while Rwanda bled, Bosnia faced its own massacre under the eyes of the world. Chapter 34. The Srebrenica Massacre, 1995, Bosnia. In July 1995, the UN declared Srebrenica a safe zone for Bosnian Muslims. But safety was an illusion. Serbian forces stormed the enclave, and Dutch peacekeepers stood aside. Over 8,000 men and boys were separated, executed, and dumped into mass graves. Mothers begged at the gates, watching their families disappear forever. Europe swore never again after the Holocaust, yet it happened again in plain sight. For years, denials and cover-ups clouded the truth, until tribunals exposed the scale. Srebrenica remains Europe's darkest post-war stain, and as Bosnia mourned, a war in Iraq began on the back of lies about weapons of mass destruction. Chapter 35. The Iraq WMD Deception, 2003, USA. In 2003, the world was told Iraq held weapons of mass destruction. Leaders claimed evidence was undeniable, but it was a lie. The invasion toppled Saddam Hussein, but no WMDs were ever found. Instead, Iraq descended into chaos, suicide bombings, sectarian war, and millions displaced. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died in a conflict built on falsehoods. Governments called it liberation. For Iraqis, it was devastation. The lie about WMDs didn't just destroy a nation, it shattered trust in Western leaders. And those lies would echo again, this time in Libya, where intervention left a country in ruins. Chapter 36. The Libyan Intervention Scandal, 2011. NATO. In 2011, NATO declared its mission in Libya was to protect civilians. Airstrikes began, targeting Gaddafi's forces, but the mission quickly expanded. Protection turned into regime change. Gaddafi was killed, his government collapsed, and Libya plunged into chaos. Militias rose, weapons spread across Africa, and human trafficking flourished in the vacuum. What was sold as a humanitarian effort became a catastrophe. Western leaders called it success, while Libya fractured into warlords and ruins, and while Libya collapsed, bombs continued falling on civilians in Yemen, hidden behind diplomatic silence. Chapter 37. The Yemen Civilian Bombings. 2010's Saudi-led coalition in Yemen airstrikes turned weddings, funerals, and marketplaces into killing fields. A Saudi-led coalition, backed by Western weapons, dropped bombs that shattered villages and hospitals alike. Thousands of civilians died, many of them children. Yet governments supplying the bombs denied responsibility, calling it collateral damage. Humanitarian groups screamed for accountability, but the world's most powerful nations turned away. Yemen became not just a war zone, but a laboratory of silence. And as Yemen starved under bombs, another minority was hunted from their homes in Myanmar. Chapter 38. The Rohingya Ethnic Cleansing. 2017. Myanmar. In 2017, Myanmar's military descended on Rohingya villages with fire and gunfire. Homes were torched, women assaulted, entire families slaughtered. Survivors fled into Bangladesh, trudging through rivers and fields with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Nearly 1 million became refugees overnight. Yet Myanmar's leaders called it counterinsurgency, erasing the crimes behind official words. The Rohingya lost not just their homes, but their history. And while Myanmar denied its crimes, China built camps that swallowed entire communities. Chapter 39. The Uyghur re-education camps. China ongoing in Xinjiang. China calls them re-education centers. But the stories tell another tale. Uyghur Muslims detained en masse, separated from families, forced into indoctrination, labor, and silence. Mosques demolished, traditions banned, children taken from parents. Satellite images revealed vast prison-like facilities, yet officials insist they are schools. Survivors describe torture, sterilization, and brainwashing. It's a campaign not just of imprisonment, but of erasing identity itself. And long before Xinjiang, another empire used camps, this time in Africa, during a forgotten war. Chapter 40. The Forgotten Boer War concentration camps. 18,991,902. British Empire. During the Boer War in South Africa, the British pioneered a cruel tactic: concentration camps. Civilians, mostly women and children, were rounded up, crammed into camps where disease and hunger killed tens of thousands. Conditions were squalid, medical care absent, food scarce. These camps became death traps, yet Britain called it a necessary measure of war. Official accounts softened the horror, burying the suffering of innocents beneath imperial pride. The first concentration camps didn't come from the Nazis, they came from the empire that claimed to stand for civilization. And decades later, on the Korean peninsula, civilians would face massacres erased by the fog of war. Chapter 41. The Korean War's Civilian Massacres. 195,053. The Korean War is remembered as a clash between North and South, communism and democracy, but hidden beneath the official narratives are the bodies of civilians massacred by both sides. In 1950, at places like No-Gun-Ri, refugees fleeing the front lines were gunned down by U.S. soldiers, mistaken for enemy infiltrators. Entire families were torn apart in minutes. In the north, mass executions targeted suspected collaborators, filling shallow graves by the thousands. Both governments later denied or buried the truth, branding the dead as necessary. Sacrifices. The Korean War wasn't just a stalemate. It was a slaughterhouse where civilians were erased from the story. For survivors, silence became the only shield. And while Korea's dead were hidden in shadows, Germany's cities faced firestorms unleashed by its enemies. Chapter 42. The Dresden firebombing, 1945. We Allies. In February 1945, as Germany staggered toward defeat, the Allies targeted Dresden. Once called the Florence of the Elbe, It was a cultural jewel packed with refugees. Then came the bombers. Wave after wave of incendiaries rained down, igniting a firestorm so intense it sucked oxygen from the streets. Families suffocated in cellars, their bodies later found melted together by the heat. Tens of thousands were killed in a single night of terror. Yet official history framed it as strategy, not slaughter. The victims were brushed aside, their suffering minimized because the perpetrators were victors. Dresden was more than a bombing. It was proof that morality in war is written by those who win. And Dresden was only a prelude. Days later, entire cities would vanish in blinding light. Chapter 43. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Silenced Aftermath, 1945. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was obliterated in a single flash. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Tens of thousands were incinerated instantly. Survivors staggered through ruins, their skin hanging in strips, their screams echoing against the silence of cities reduced to ash. But the horror didn't end with the blast. Radiation poisoned rivers, destroyed crops, and condemned countless survivors hibakusha to slow, painful deaths. Their suffering was silenced. U.S. officials censored photographs and banned reports of radiation sickness. For years, the world saw only headlines of victory, not the human cost. The bombings weren't just acts of war, they were experiments, with civilians as test subjects. The aftermath was erased so the world would see power, not pain. And as Japan struggled in silence, Europe built secret armies waiting for wars that never came. Chapter 44. Operation Gladio. NATO's secret armies. Cold War. During the Cold War, NATO created secret stay-behind armies across Europe. Officially, they were meant to resist a Soviet invasion. Unofficially, some became tools of terror. In Italy, members of Gladio were linked to bombings blamed on leftists, attacks designed to sway elections through fear. In Belgium, mysterious shootings left civilians dead, their killers never caught. These false flag operations blurred the line between defense and deception, using bloodshed to shape politics. For decades, Gladio's existence was denied. When exposed in the 1990s, governments scrambled to explain, yet many questions remain unanswered, files still locked, testimonies silenced. Operation Gladio wasn't about safety, it was about control, and its ghosts still linger in Europe's memory. And in the 21st century, when one man exposed global surveillance, governments tried once again to bury the truth. Chapter 45. The Snowden Revelations. 2013. NSA Surveillance. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA was not just spying on enemies, it was spying on everyone. Millions of phone calls, emails, and private messages were swept into vast databases. Allies were tapped. Ordinary citizens were monitored without consent. The revelations tore away the mask. Governments that preached freedom had been building digital prisons, watching their own people in silence. Officials called Snowden a traitor, not because he lied, but because he told the truth. The scandal wasn't only about surveillance, it was about trust shattered forever. If governments could erase privacy itself, what else could they erase? The forbidden textbook closes here, but its lesson is clear. History is not what happened. History is what power allows you to remember. Final payoff. 45 chapters. 45 events governments wanted erased, silenced, or rewritten. Yet here they are, bound together like the missing pages of a forbidden book. Each massacre, each coup, each deception is proof that history is not a record, it is a weapon sharpened by those in power. What you were taught was the edited edition, scrubbed clean of shame. But the real stories never die. They wait in whispers, in graves, in photographs smuggled through time, and when they surface, they shatter illusions. The truth is this: governments don't just fear dissent, they fear memory. Because memory is rebellion. To remember is to resist. The book is never truly closed. There are more pages, more secrets, more silences yet to be broken, and every time one is exposed, another lie crumbles. History belongs to those who refuse to forget.